Hi, everybody. This is Professor Angelo, and welcome to another installation of our Early American History program. These podcasts are coming out for chapters that relate to the Tindall and Shi book, American Narrative History. So now we're going to talk about the Jacksonian era. And what gets a lot of students tripped up right away is they think of just the 8 years that he was president. But in reality, the Jacksonian period really starts at around 1820 and goes to 1840. And that's because Jackson, in many ways, rode a wave of popular democracy into the White House and really made it uniquely his own. So he's an especially interesting president because he tried to expand presidential authority in order to reduce the scope and role of the federal government. So he had kind of like this vision of himself that said that he should have as much power as he could possibly want so he could shrink the power of the federal government. And he if you think about that for a second, those are really two very different things. And so he's going to behave as a tyrant in order to end tyranny. So it was this interesting role that he decided to take on. And he really sort of looked at himself as the champion of the people in what he called the Revolution of 1828, or the era of the common man. So Jackson was inaugurated at a time when the country was growing at a very rapid rate. Land purchasing was going on at very high levels. The United States now had 24 states and almost 13 million people. And Americans would see market-based economy emerge from the traditional economy of subsistence farming, and what we had talked about in the earlier chapter 8. So Jackson had really made a name for himself. He was orphaned as a teenager. He had fought in the War of 1812 and had been basically one of its biggest heroes. But he has a military record that goes back to the Revolution. He was actually a very young boy. And the story goes he got up to defend his mother, and a British officer took his sword and basically slashed his cheek open to, in a sense, teach him a lesson or whatever. But so Jackson is, in many ways, a personification of the era. He moved west, which back then was the state of Tennessee, and literally made a man of wealth for himself in an era where that was, not very typical. And his victory at the Battle of New Orleans allowed his fame to be increased quite a bit. And then, of course, the Seminole Wars did it even more. And so he brings to the presidency the movement that we refer to today as populism. Now, this is the idea of appealing to the common man. Pretending as though you are this ordinary person. And there's no question that Jackson was a young man who, sort of built himself up out of nothing. However, at the time that he takes the presidency, he was the U.S. general in charge of all American forces. He was the sitting senator for the state of Tennessee. He was hardly a person of the common thread. He was very wealthy at that point. He had a very large plantation called the Hermitage with a couple hundred slaves working for him. This was a man who today would be considered, one of the elites in America. But his language and his rhetoric and his resume spoke to a westward migrating, growing population that led to something called universal white male suffrage. And Jackson's basically the first president to be elected under this. Now, it's a hard concept to understand through the text, and really just at all. And what you have to do here is you have to remember that prior to the 1820s, you could not vote in the United States unless you were white male over the age of 21 who owned property. Now, this was common in the Western world. This was not abnormal in any way, shape, or form. However, as America was expanding west and doing so really very rapidly, it was very difficult for these new states and territories to determine who was actually qualified to vote. There was a considerable amount of land sales going to individuals who had no intention of ever living in the West. These were very large groups like the Ohio Company, but then there were individuals who were also investing in these properties in the West as banks and all sorts of other institutions as well. And so if you follow the adult male landowner, well, then in theory, you would have individuals who were qualified to vote in several states. And this becomes an inconsistency because when these newer states and territories were trying to put together their voting rolls, they quickly realized they couldn't track exactly who was there and who wasn't there, who owned land, who didn't own land. So in many ways, for expediency's sake, a lot of the western states, starting with Ohio and Indiana and others, dropped the property requirement and instead went with what we call a residency requirement. You had to prove that you were in fact residing in the property within that state or territory. So what this did then was created even a greater attraction for people on the East Coast to move west. This created a dilemma for, particularly in the Northeast, where laborers were needed for these growing new industrial centers. And so they started to drop their property requirements in order to encourage some of these mobile populations to in fact stay where they were. And so the consequence of this was that over a period of, I'd say, about 8 to 10 years, all of the states in the Union had dropped their property requirements. Now, the misunderstanding here is a lot of people think that this was done by federal law, and that is not true. This was done by the states. And so this was, in fact, a rather substantial grassroots movement that started from the bottom up and from the west to the east. And Jackson, in a sense, rode the wave into this. So now, Jackson believed that it was best to have politicians serve in every branch of office instead of career bureaucrats. Now, he did this because he believed that bureaucrats who remain in office in perpetuity, in other words, become career workers, if you will at some point become a form of corruption in and of themselves, and they'll begin to operate what's in their best interest rather than what's in the national best interest. And this is a very big thing that he had in his mindset. And I think I had talked about this before, but if you can read chapter 10 and not be thinking of Donald Trump, I'm not sure you're reading the same book I am, or books. You hear a lot of the same rhetoric in Donald Trump's words and speeches and his comebacks and his tweets, right? He has this horrible disdain for the bureaucracy, for the actual workers in the federal government, because he feels they're out to get him, and he draws on this. Jackson was the same way, and he will openly defy them. And so Jackson is credited for dividing that single party. The Democratic Republicans break in 1826. Jackson forms the Democrat Party, which is the present-day Democrats. The National Republicans were the former Federalists, for the most part, who are going to try to combat Jackson's popularity. And this becomes really kind of difficult. So we're going to backtrack a little bit to that election of 1824 that's covered at the end of the last chapter. And John Quincy Adams and John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay are the two sort of standard bearers of that wing of the larger party that becomes a separate party. They actually were not very fond of each other. Adams was a very sort of austere New England Harvard graduate kind of thing. Henry Clay was a frontiersman, Southerner, that kind of a thing, and they didn't necessarily care for one another. The presidency of John Quincy Adams brought the two together because Henry Clay was his Secretary of State, and as we remember, the corrupt bargain that comes into place here. And John Calhoun was in the Democratic Republicans, as was William Crawford. Crawford's an interesting character because he was Monroe's Secretary of the Treasury, which was also a very powerful position to have. And what happens, of course, is, Jackson loses, but then in the rematch in 1828, Jackson is able to convince John C. Calhoun to switch allegiances from the Democratic Republicans to the Democrats. William Crawford passes away. Crawford may have been what I would consider a moderate alternative to Andrew Jackson, but he passes away. And Calhoun decides, now this is my own take on this, I perceive in here a moment where John C. Calhoun could see the popular movement afoot, and he saw Jackson as this raw, unchecked ball of energy that was just sweeping through American politics. And I believe that Calhoun believed he could be the power behind the throne, that as the vice president and the quote-unquote president of the Senate, Calhoun, would actually be pulling the strings, and that Jackson, whom he considered to be not very educated or refined, would rely on Calhoun to navigate the intricacies of government and the sort of world of Washington, D.C. And that was a very, very bad estimate on his part. Jackson wins overwhelmingly in 1828, and we get this really bizarre situation. People came pouring in from all over the country to watch the inauguration in 1829. People were fascinated to see, quote unquote, their president be inaugurated. They felt that they had been ripped off in 1824, and now they thought that the real revolution was going to be on its way. And what happens is really quite simply a fiasco. So back then, as you could see from this lithograph, there were no fences around the White House. And it was a tradition in the early republic that on Inauguration Day, the new president would ride in his carriage to the Capitol building and take the oath of office and give a speech to the members of Congress and any members of the courts that would wish to participate. He would then ride down Pennsylvania Avenue. There were some types of parades that were there to take him down to that spot. And then essentially there was an open reception at the White House that would last for pretty much most of the day. The president would sit and, basically greet anybody who came. It was not a restricted invitation. And quite simply, a whole bunch of everyday Americans quite literally crashed the party. And it is a Donnybrook. I mean, it is a frat party. Furniture gets damaged. People quickly become drunk. The president had to order the punch bowls to be taken out into the White House lawns just to get people to leave the house so that they could save furniture and pieces of china that had been broken and everything. It was really unbelievable. It's really kind of telling about what we're going to have go on. So Jackson, who was unaccustomed to the political infighting in Washington, D.C., found himself entwined in a big, huge political war with Vice President John C. Calhoun and the Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren. Now, Van Buren had encouraged Jackson in his career, and Van Buren proves to be a lot more skillful behind the scenes than John C. Calhoun. In fact, Van Buren, who had been known as Old Kinderhook, which is a term for people from New York. He was from a Dutch patroon family. And he was also referred to as the Little Magician because behind the scenes, he could make things happen. And so this populist presidency gets started, and Jackson quickly realizes that while his persona and his rhetoric gets him lots of kudos with the average American people, inside Washington, D.C., it's not flying at all. And the signs of it were there actually before he even was elected. So during the election of 1828, rivals of Mr. Jackson uncovered a scandal that involved his wife, Rachel Jackson. Now, in many ways, it's quite a touching love story. Andrew Jackson was not a very affectionate person, but in his time in New Orleans, he had come into contact with Rachel Jackson, who had been married. She was a married woman. And what happens is her marriage was abusive. And I don't know exactly the extent of that, but it was enough for her to file for divorce. And so Jackson and his wife married, but sometime afterwards, they were made aware that Rachel Jackson's divorce had not been legally finalized. This technically made Rachel Jackson a polygamist under the law. The president and his wife, or back then General Jackson and his wife, very quietly engaged attorneys and had the entire thing taken care of. And by that, I do not mean anything nefarious. It's not like he bribed people or, tried to get away with something. They were clearly ignorant of what was going on, or at least that's the narrative that we have. And as was very normal back then, this was paid to be kept quiet. But somebody talked, and it got into the newspapers. Now, what was very common in Washington, D.C., and it's important to remember, at this stage, the Jacksons are living in Washington, D.C., because Andrew Jackson was at that point senator from the state of Tennessee. And the political wives of Washington organized what was referred to as the congressional season or the party season, social season of Washington, D.C. And it mirrored the congressional session. Most people left D.C. during the summers. It was almost entirely vacated during those months. And so when they returned, the ladies, usually organized by the First Lady and her cohorts, would set up these parties. And it was very bipartisan. Everybody was expected to attend because everybody was invited. And cordiality was the name of the game. However, if an individual was thought to be of ill repute, they were not to be included, a process that we would today refer to as shunning. And this is really rather brutal. Women in Washington, D.C. would literally refuse to acknowledge somebody's presence, even if confronted face to face. It was really a blatantly rude and horrible thing to do, but it was a norm. And so what happened was Rachel Jackson was mortified by this revelation. And she went into what they referred to at the time of a severe case of melancholy, what we would today call severe depression. And she became very, very ill. After the president won, they were at their place in the Hermitage in Tennessee, and Rachel Jackson suffered a heart attack and died. Jackson was not a forgiving person. Operatives within the Democratic Party informed him that the belief was that Henry Clay had in fact orchestrated this release. And Henry Clay is going to be an enemy of Jackson's forever. And that was the thing about Jackson. When you were his enemy for life. He was not going to let go of the grudge forever. So when Jackson comes to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, he comes in mourning. He's, officially not supposed to be doing any social events at all. And he's incredibly enraged and very depressed. Now, in the early stages of his presidency, a similar affair breaks out. Now, the Secretary of War, John Eaton, had married a woman named Margaret, or Peggy, and they married only 3 months after her first husband had committed suicide. Now, the rumor in Washington was that the husband committed suicide because he was made aware of John and Peggy Eaton's relationship, and that this had driven him to suicide. And so, as such, Peggy Eaton was seen as a woman of ill repute. She was from St. Louis, Missouri, out in the frontier. There were some rumors that her mother had owned a hotel that had prostitutes in it and all sorts, and that perhaps even that Peggy herself had been a prostitute. There was all these rumors that were going on. Now, the women of Washington, D.C. decided that Peggy Eaton was not proper for social engagement, and a shunning of Peggy Eaton began. Jackson is made aware of this, and it sends him into the stratosphere. Now, you have to kind of imagine this, right? This is a social issue. This is really kind of like People magazine kind of thing. And Jackson decides to inject himself into this, and at one point sits the entire cabinet down and basically tells them, look, you go home and tell your wives that they're going to do what they're told, and you tell them that they are not to do this anymore. And the cabinet resigns, except for Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, who had difficulties with Jackson, kind of back and forth. But this remedies this immediately. John C. Calhoun will become the first vice president in American history to resign, in part over this, the moral inturpitude of the administration, as he put it. And John C. Calhoun is a rather crafty person here, but the Peggy Eaton affairs rift in the administration underscored this struggle within the elites of both parties and dealing with this rising populism in the political sphere and what to do about it, because many of them had no idea. Most of the people in Congress were some of the most elite, highest educated people in their communities, and now they were confronting this populist wave, and Jackson was the front of it. And so the next thing that breaks out is a debate over internal improvements. Now, today we would call these public works projects or infrastructure projects. At the time, the issue was about should the federal government finance roads, bridges, canals, railroads construction, which is in its very earliest stages, port facilities, especially when they lie solely within a state. Jackson is 100% against this. But what he's going to do is he is going to attack projects, particularly when they're in states that belong to his rivals. And I'll kind of get into that in a second. So now, what happens is John C. Calhoun is the vice president of the United States in 1828 under President John Quincy Adams. And Calhoun had already declared himself to be a Democrat, not a national Republican. And so, as I stated in an earlier podcast, he orchestrates this tariff in 1828 in order to embarrass, basically, John Quincy Adams to hopefully make him unelectable. And in some ways, I guess it worked. But the tariff itself actually ended up being passed, which Calhoun had hoped wouldn't happen. Now, what happens here is Calhoun is going to resurrect the theory of nullification. Now, what you have to do here is you have to go back to 1798. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson ghost wrote resolutions called the Virginia-Kentucky Resolutions that essentially said that because the states relinquished sovereignty to create the Union, they had a vested interest in federal statute. And if they felt that a federal law violated the Constitution, they did not have to enforce it in their states. They could, quote unquote, nullify the law within their borders. Now, that theory of nullification had been embraced by members of the Federalist Party in New England who were vehemently against the War of 1812. And so many of them tried to embrace this idea of breaking up the Union because of a failure to nullify. Well, as we've read, this destroyed the Federalist Party because in the victory and in the nationalism of 1815, it looked like treason. But now things are changing. The state of South Carolina had suffered some economic malaise, and the tariff was going to increase the financial burdens on many farmers and plantation owners of the South. And this is the bread and butter of John C. Calhoun's, power. And so the problem, of course, is he resurrects a theory that is now going to become the foundation of Southern intransigence and eventually secession. Because if you think about it, what is the logical conclusion of a nullifying concept? This idea that you can just sort of ignore what the federal government does is to, in fact, separate yourself from it. So it's a really bad idea that gets resurrected by Calhoun. And the thing is, many Southern Democrats are going to wholeheartedly jump into this. Jackson, himself a Southern Democrat, who was essentially a states' rights advocate, which this is, an advocacy of states' rights, is going to find himself in a real quandary because he was, in a very odd sense, a very nationalist states' rights advocate, which again is contradictory. Very much that you see in a Donald Trump. So in the spirit of all of this, in 1831, a debate breaks out in the Senate. Now, it was actually on land sales policy. How rapidly should the federal government be releasing land for sale? And the idea here was that the faster the land became available, the more land became available, and therefore the prices remained low. Now, for New Englanders, this was draining populations that they felt they needed for industry. And so this debate evolves into a larger conversation about states' rights versus the priorities of the nation. And we get what's called the Webster-Hayne debate. And now, the debate basically turns into a debate over nullification and whether or not states' rights actually include such a power. And Webster, who was the grand orator of the Senate until his passing in the 1850s, basically, I wouldn't say tricked, but sort of guides Hayne of South Carolina into making a rather impassioned speech for states' rights and nullification. And Webster stands up and gives this oratory about, I paraphrase a little bit here, but he's like, let not my eyes close on a broken and divided nation, and liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. And it brings down the house. People were in the galleries, were crowded, and people were just cheering and screaming. And Calhoun takes it as rather a direct slam. But the rift between Jackson and Calhoun becomes earth-shattering, I guess would be a good way to put it. Calhoun decides to step down as the vice president. Excuse me for a second here. Hold on. And he does this because a rift develops between them because of nullification. And then Calhoun resigned the vice presidency. He said he did it to sacrifice himself for the purpose of moral standards and for the dignity of the states' rights position. But he already knew that he was going to be offered the spot in the Senate for the state of South Carolina. Senator Hayne had been, I believe, elected as the new governor of South Carolina because of his speech, and Calhoun knew he was going to be appointed, and so it was rather disingenuous. But anyway, Jackson decided that this was just ridiculous. Now, here's the thing. Martin Van Buren, who has repositioned himself very powerfully in the administration, is now allowing Jackson to be told all these things about Calhoun that Jackson was really not aware of. So, for instance, Jackson finds out that it was Calhoun that wanted him court-martialed in 1819 when he rode into Florida and created the international incident that he did. He finds out that Calhoun's wife had orchestrated the shunning of Peggy Eaton. He finds out that Calhoun was trying to embarrass him by bringing up issues in social situations, essentially trying to force Jackson to do things. And Jackson just becomes incensed, and he's just literally furious. And at the time, there was a very popular Jefferson Day dinner. You have to remember now, Thomas Jefferson was the founder of the Democratic Republican Party. So both National Republicans and Democrats believed that they were the offspring, if you will, of Jefferson's political philosophy. So every year on his birthday was a very large social event called the Jefferson Day Dinner. It was a holiday. Everybody enjoyed themselves. And so now Jackson finds out. Now I should back this up. There was a tradition back then, something that you would learn if you joined Toastmasters, for instance. It was a party game. Technically it's supposed to be the host of the evening stands up towards the beginning of the things, and he gives a toast. And whatever theme that individual chooses becomes the theme for the evening. And it's now up to everyone else who wants to play this game to outdo the other Toastmasters. And Jackson loved this game. He was famous for his sense of humor and his quirkiness and his ability to, bring down the house with sometimes body quips. But he's excited about this, but then finds out just prior to going that Calhoun has rigged the toasts so that everybody in there would be making a toast in support of states' rights, the theory of nullification. And remember, Jackson's a committed states' rights advocate, but he also believes in the Union staying together. He's a big nationalist who believed in states' rights. So this was really meant to force Jackson to take a very, very public pro-states' rights stand, which Jackson always avoided public direct statements because he was more focused on the populist message of hero of New Orleans and the Indian slayer of Horseshoe Bend, right? He does all these different things. And so what happens is he does this stare down of Calhoun, and after he'd had pretty much enough of all these states' rights toast, he stood up, supposedly looked Calhoun straight in the face, and said, "To the Union, it must be preserved." And in the silence that follows, Calhoun supposedly stands up and grabs his wine glass and says, "To the Union, sir. Next to our liberty, most dear." And the rift is permanent. Now, what Calhoun does then is he helps to orchestrate an ordinance in South Carolina to nullify the 1828 and 1832 tariffs. And this is a test of nullification. And it's also let's say, a chance for Jackson to articulate his take on federal authority. And I have to say, it's splitting hairs. He's essentially going to say that his articulation of federal power, that being that the president has full executive powers to execute the laws of the United States when he perceives that they're in the national interest, and that other states' rights, or what we refer to as the reserved powers, are guaranteed to the states. So he's doing, in a sense, a two-step. And he borrows a little bit from James Madison here, which is unique. Because what he basically does is, for instance, with internal improvements, maybe we should be doing this at the federal level, but because this project's all inside the state, it's not interstate, it's interstate or intra-state, and therefore falls out of the purview of the Constitution. Now, the internal improvement that he just vetoed was in Kentucky, which is Henry Clay's home state. So, it's this very unique thing. But in many ways, Jackson is articulating something that we see in James Madison, we see it in James Monroe, and we see it in George Washington. This idea that the national government has to be powerful, it has to have its own power. But the 10th Amendment guarantees certain rights to the states, and those have to be respected. Now, what he does is he basically threatens to go down to South Carolina with an army and collect the tax himself, something referred to as the force bill. And what happens, of course, the people of South Carolina get the message and basically decide to repeal the nullification and basically avert what would have been a major face-off between the state of South Carolina and the President of the United States. So now Jackson's policy in reference to Native Americans, in reference to Indians, is one that is heart-wrenching, incredibly unacceptable in a modern construct. At least I'm assuming and hoping that this is the way everyone will feel. And yet Jackson's mindset was, in my opinion, very much in line with the majority of Americans. And that was that while Indians might be really cool and kind of exciting and romantic and admirable because they kind of embodied what Enlightenment thinkers called the noble savage, that regardless of all that wonderful stuff, Indian civilization was simply not equal to European civilization. And therefore, if they ever have to exist together, the Indian civilization will be overrun. Now, I have some problems with this because I see it more as a rationalization than a theory. And Jackson is engaged in a form of ethnic cleansing, which, of course, we can't really call it that because people really didn't operate under those theories then. But this is one of those moments where we can have a little bit of freedom to come down rather hard on Andrew Jackson, in fact, the majority of the American people. And that is because the Indian removal had to do with a group of Indians that had already made settlements with the United States. In other words, they had already agreed to surrender substantial amounts of their original territory for westward expansion, and had, in many ways, embraced Western culture. Now, there were 5 major Indian nations, and you see them on this map, and they were, in a very patronizing way, referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. And this is the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee. And so these tribes had embraced Christianity. They turned to Western form of dress. They codified their laws. They codified their language. They had, in many cases, not in all cases, they had a constitution, and they advocated for themselves. They were an educated, Christianized part of American society, and in many ways, they were doing what Thomas Jefferson hoped that they would have done back in the 1780s, and that is to basically organize Republican forms of government. And had Jefferson's original theory been practiced, there would have been basically a petition to the Congress of the United States for the creation of the state of Seminole, the state of Cherokee, the state of Chickasaw, right? I mean, this is what would have been the Jeffersonian vision. But instead, they're going to be ordered to be removed from territories in the east into what is today Oklahoma, or what was then called Indian Territory. But that's before there was that happening. We get a series of Supreme Court decisions, and there's many of them, but our book touches on really just 2 of the major cases: Cherokee v. Georgia and Worcester v. Georgia. And these are 2 of the last Supreme Court decisions by John Marshall, the Chief Justice, who was appointed in 1801. So John Marshall is still on the bench in 1834 when he writes the majority opinion in the Cherokee case. And this is, I think, really important for us to study in modern America, because, in my opinion, Marshall articulates in his opinion a very modern concept of U.S.-Indian relations. And in the Cherokee case, the state of Georgia was trying to take land from the Cherokee because they believed that there were gold deposits there to be found. In fact, that there were. In the Worcester case, a missionary from Massachusetts was living on Cherokee land, and Georgia had passed a state law saying that everyone residing in the state of Georgia had to take an oath of allegiance to the state of Georgia. And Worcester, who was, of course, a resident of the state of Massachusetts, refused to do so. And this created these 2 Supreme Court cases. And in the first, Cherokee v. Georgia, Marshall writes this decision in which he basically says, if I wanted to go and make up, like pretend, make a fake case that would underscore just how horrible this Indian policy is, I couldn't make it up better. This is just too exactly what is the problem. And he basically spells out how Indian tribes were foreign entities within domestic borders. And this is why we have treaties with them, because it's essentially foreign policy, which, if you read the Constitution, it's really quite clear. Indian policy, Indian trade, Indian negotiations were within the purview of the federal government. Therefore, Georgia has no jurisdiction in this case. Now, what I find interesting about this ruling is that Marshall is making this in 1832. I can't remember exactly the date. I want to say 34, but that may be the Worcester case. But regardless, he's making this decision, and he's writing this opinion after this Congress has passed the Indian Removal Act, ordering these Indians to negotiate with the federal government to surrender the rest of their land and move west. He knows this, but he spells this out and basically excoriates the United States government for this abuse. And he ordered, well, the opinion said that the federal government has an obligation to defend Cherokee lands from what he called, quote, undue molestation by the state of Georgia. Now, supposedly, when Jackson was told of the ruling, he made the comment, Marshall made his opinion, let Marshall enforce it. Meaning, I'm not sending any troops down there to defend the Cherokee. And in fact, this doesn't happen. And we get instead the Trail of Tears. So the so-called 5 civilized tribes are going to be decimated. The Cherokee actually break apart because one group of Cherokee, in my opinion, is secretly and illegally engaged in negotiations with the federal government, got a big chunk of money out of it, and convinced a bunch of Cherokees called the Western Cherokees to move to Oklahoma. The others stayed and fought back and are still there, the East Cherokee. And a lot of bad blood in there. This was nothing less than a state land grab. And Chief Justice Marshall just lays it out. This is what it is. And it's nothing else but. And so we as modern citizens of the United States can look at that ruling and say, see, people at the time, not just ordinary people, right? The Supreme Court of the United States saw this for what it was, a thinly veiled land grab that was, today what we would call an act of genocide. There's just no other way to talk about it. And the other thing we want to remember is that the Indians did resist, particularly the Seminoles. Seminoles fought for a very long time, and many of them did not leave. And so, but this Trail of Tears is literally killing thousands of people, men, women, children, old people. It's just, an abhorrent reality of American history. And yet, we have to understand something. Andrew Jackson's failure to act today would be considered an impeachable offense. Nothing happens to Jackson. And, the Cherokee are going to lose over 9,000 members of their tribe over an 800-mile walk to Oklahoma. And he suffers no consequence. In fact, it enhances his position. The states' rights advocates love it. And many of the American people, even those who believe that they were quote-unquote sympathetic to the plight of Indians, believe that this was for the best, that this was going to protect them and save them. I mean, it really was a reflection of the popular will regarding Indians. And it doesn't make it right, but it just explains how this could go on. And so if you know individuals who are from the Native American populations in the United States, hopefully you'll begin to understand why they want Andrew Jackson's picture taken off the $20 bill. Right? I mean, imagine it's reprehensible, and it's why the long-term plan, it's supposed to be short-term, but for some reason they stopped it. Harriet Tubman is supposed to be placed on the $10 bill. So as you can see here in this portrait, right, there's an attempt here to paint this noble thing, but really it's about people trying to remain dignified in what can only be explained. I mean, this is horrible. We promised them blankets, we promised them food, we promised them money. None of it came. People were literally marched. I mean, it was a death march. And for a very long time, even when I was a kid, it was portrayed as, oh, look at us doing these great things to help the Indians to, not be attacked by white people. And it's just like, oh my God, right? It's embarrassing. So now, Jackson was an old school Republican when it came to the national bank. he believed that the only acceptable form of money or specie was hard currency, meaning gold or silver, not paper. And that's because banks could issue paper notes. And technically, the notes were supposed to reflect the amount of gold and silver an individual had on deposit at that bank. But there were no laws governing how that price fixation would actually go into place. In other words, how you actually pegged the dollar or the banknote was not uniform. And so there were multiple instances of corruption and, just bad banking policies. And a lot of people are going to lose everything they've got. And so there were a number of individuals in the United States who were against the national bank. And this were the state banks who were really not able to compete with the national bank because they didn't have their the national bank. Just to kind of recap, 25% of its holdings were federal deposits, meaning the taxpayers' money was held in the national bank. And so the national bank was open to the public, but it also had the exclusive right to do all of the financial business of the federal government. Well, this gave them a lot of capital to deal with, and state banks found it very difficult to compete with that. And so they resented it. And now, anti-federalists, who were predominantly in the Democrat Party, also have hated the bank ever since it was first proposed in 1791. So they were continuing to hold their resentment. There were also people, remember, we're talking about this era of the common man populism, and a lot of average Americans who were now voting for the first time found the bank to be controlled by elitist, financial, inner circle, well-connected snobs. And the fact is, they were. And so in 1832, the bank recharter came up. Now, I should state that Jackson sees this as a political ploy. The bank was going to expire in 1836. The recharter comes up in 1832. So it was very clear that this was done to publicly force Jackson to take a stand on a very controversial issue, and he resents them for it. No surprise there, right? So now, Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Bank of the United States. He came from an incredibly wealthy, very old money family from Philadelphia. And he had created a network of relationships between himself and major industrialists, between the bank and members of the Congress. He had appointed Daniel Webster to be chairman of the board. He had granted free accounts to all the members of the Congress. And he arranged loans for wealthy people, connected people. And so just to give you one insight, members of Congress would very frequently overdraft on their account. They would not have enough money to cover obligations. And rather than deny those, Nicholas Biddle would sign off on them and simply send a very nice, polite note to the member and say, hey, this is what happened, and if you would be so kind as to remit payment, and he would just be very patient. And so he had built up a lot of gravitas with members of the Congress. And so it had become, quite honestly, an inner circle, a good old boys network that did not really work for the average American. Daniel Webster himself had multiple loans and debts through the bank. And he and Henry Clay both really believed that the bank was essential for the United States to build its industrial sector. And so they were 100% all for it. But Jackson surprised the supporters of the bill by vetoing it. and they didn't have enough votes in Congress to override it. They needed 2/3. Henry Clay and Biddle orchestrated this to force Jackson to take a stand. And the thinking was, it's an election year. If he does it, he'll be so unpopular that he won't get reelected. And therefore, the National Republican candidate, which ironically was going to be Henry Clay, he would become president, and they would still have 4 years of the original charter to reintroduce a bill to renew the charter. And Clay, of course, would sign it readily. And so when Jackson vetoed it and they couldn't muster the override, it was seen as an absolute disaster. And so the fight for 1832 comes into play. And this very popular cartoon of the period, King Andrew I, gets published at this time. And there were several campaign innovations that came into run here. There was the country's first third party emerged in the 1820s called the Anti-Mason Party. And they addressed this whole idea of the secret inner circle of the caucus system, of the banking system and whatnot. And they called for having a national election to hold a nominating convention to choose candidates. Rather than having party leaders do it secretly, they called on the country to do this publicly. And Jackson embraces this in 1832 because it plays into the populist message. And so the other was to actually actively campaign. So it had been the tradition for candidates to basically stay at home and allow other people to speak for him. Jackson is going to be the first to kind of go out on the campaign trail, to give speeches, to promote himself. And these are very big innovations for politics that still basically remain today. So we have the immortal trio of Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, all three of whom are against Andrew Jackson. And so Clay is now up against the biggest elites of American government. And again, I'm asking you, think of Donald Trump. He has pissed off every single member of what we would probably call the inner circle elites of American politics. I don't like it, but that's what it is. And so Jackson's now at war. And I mean, he's at war. He is not holding back one iota. He is going after these people. And the nullification crisis, the bank war, Clay's candidacy for the presidency just gets Jackson all fired up. And so the election of 1832 is no question a referendum on populism versus elitism. And essentially Jackson just sails through to a second term. And much of this comes from what's referred to as the new penny press. And the reason for that is innovations in power generation, mostly water power, is allowing, it's then going to go to steam, but this allows for the printing press to use removable type, and so, or I should say movable type, so that newspapers can be printed faster and more cheaply. And they're going to call it the penny papers. And so, every little community had its own newspaper. And Jackson and his supporters really utilized that. If you remember the sort of cartoon in the previous slide, Jackson is not seen as somebody who kills the bank. He's our great leader with his sword fighting back against the multi-headed hydra of the bank. And one of the heads is Calhoun, and one of the heads is Nicholas Biddle, and the other head is Daniel Webster, and there's Jackson fighting him off with his sword. I mean, it's all very melodramatic, but again, very populist in nature. And the back side to that, however, is there emerges an anti-Jackson coalition. People who would normally not agree with each other politically, and by that I mean philosophically, are going to come together to try to bring down Andrew Jackson. And the reason for this was he won re-election in 1832 so easily with all the elites against him, with all of the big money working against him. And he still won. And he was still relatively young. And he was feisty. This man was pissed off and he was ready to fight. And they thought, my goodness, this guy is just going to get reelected ad infinitum. And we got to do something. So this George Caleb Bingham piece, he's from the Hudson River School. His work here is capturing the sort of populist moment where people are just gathered around waiting for the news of this election to get out there. And it's one of the first to utilize a new technology. And it becomes sort of this big thing of the day. So in his second term, Jackson further deflated the power of the Bank of the United States. So he was unable to disband it outright because it had 4 more years of a charter, but could only control the funds. Now, what happens is this. In the lame duck session, so in the period between Jackson's reelection and his second inauguration, which was in March of 1833, Nicholas Biddle decided to play a little lesson on the American people. He basically decided, well, you guys don't want a bank because you think it's so tyrannical? Well, let me show you what life is like without a bank. And he essentially stopped lending to some bigger people and started notifying members of Congress that they had debts owed to the bank. And it caused a what I would call a credit crunch or a dollar crash, a dollar panic, because all of a sudden money wasn't circulating. And Jackson is incensed. And he uses that to halt all payments of federal deposits into the bank and then took the money of the remaining deposits out and basically gave them to state banks, but not just any state banks. He gave them to state banks whose directors and big players had actually contributed to his campaign. And this leads to something called the pet bank scandal. So if you think of like teacher's pet as, the teacher's favorite, these banks were his pet banks. And now, again, if you want to get super technical, one could argue that this is a violation of the separation of powers because the president does not have the authority on his own to handle money and to spend money of the federal treasury without the approval of Congress. The Senate, who could not get enough support from the House to go forward with impeachment, decided to try to censure the president, which is basically a Senate vote saying that he's unfit to serve as president. And Jackson just basically laughs at him. He goes, you know what? Go after me. Get it. Let's do this. Impeach me. Let's go. And they can't. And so now an economic slowdown in Great Britain is going to lead foreign investors to put their gold and silver out of the American market. And this is going to lead to a later problem. So the fiscal measures that he does basically floods these state banks with a windfall of money that they end up speculating with. They just literally turned around and said, oh, let's buy land and let's speculate in markets. And they basically took the people's tax money and just went gambling with it. And now Jackson decided that this is the very last year of his presidency, 1836, and he decides that he's going to tighten the land sales market. He did not want to stop the amount of land provided for sale, but he wanted to bring down the overspeculation because he believed it was driving prices higher than the average American could afford. So he felt that the only way to do this was to pass a law, which isn't a law. It's kind of an order from the Treasury done by Roger Taney, Secretary of the Treasury, soon to be Supreme Court Justice. And he basically says any land sales has to be done in specie, meaning gold or silver. No banknotes, no promissory notes. They have to be done in hard currency. And this basically does the reverse. A huge boom happens in land sales. The price goes way out of reach of the average American. Banks jump in there with all this bullion they have from the federal treasury, and it results in the Panic of 1838. Or excuse me, I'm sorry, the Panic of 1837, which literally will happen a month or so after Jackson leaves office. And Jackson really suffers no popularity decrease from it. He announces that he's not going to run for re-election in 1836 and instead supports his vice president, Martin Van Buren. Now, this former Secretary of State became Jackson's running mate in 1832 and was the vice president. And he, unfortunately, is going to have to face this new coalition called the Whigs. Now, really quickly, Whig, if you guys remember from the American Revolution, was a name that came from a British political party that had been created to curb the power of the British monarch. As you saw in that previous, one of the previous slides with King Andrew I, these anti-Jackson politicians believed that Jackson was operating more like a monarch instead of a president. And so they formed the Whig Party to curb the power of King Andrew. Problem? King Andrew left. I mean, he literally was just like, nah, I think I'll go home now, and just leaves. So the Whig coalition included National Republicans, a group of anti-Jackson Democrats led by John C. Calhoun and John Tyler. These were basically anti-federalists who couldn't stay in the Anti-Federalist Party Democrats because they believed it was dominated by Jackson and they hated him, and so they left. Members of the Anti-Mason Party, who were very anti-elitist and saw Jackson as the people's president and the Jackson's party as the people's party. And then a group of evangelicals, and we're going to go over this again in a later chapter, but I've alluded to it before. There's something called the Second Great Awakening that happened starting in the late 1790s going into the early 1800s. And these evangelicals are going to take on a very aggressive social reform agenda. And they latch on to Jackson, they latch on to the Whigs. And so now, the election of 1836 has the little magician who's going to take on this populist playbook that Jackson has taught him. And he gets tangled up in a very, very controversial issue. And again, we'll talk about this again in chapter 14. I believe it's 14. But anyway, we're in this period of Manifest Destiny, early Manifest Destiny, and a number of Americans had moved into Texas and had helped to foment a rebellion against Mexico. And in 1836, the Texans win their independence, quote unquote, from Mexico. Mexico reneges on this and says that it never happened, which is kind of baloney. But Texas wrote a constitution in which was a clause to approach the United States for admissions to the Union as a slave state. And as we stated before, adding slave and free states upsets the balance of power in the Senate. So it's an incredibly controversial issue that split the country based on what region you lived in. Jackson knew it was a death sentence to talk about it, and so he convinces Van Buren to simply not address it. His opponent in 1836 was the Whig candidate, another hero from the War of 1812, William Henry Harrison. And Harrison himself didn't say anything, but Henry Clay had made a comment in which he sort of didn't quite spell out the exact position. And so essentially Van Buren is able to get reelected. And this is some people perceived as really a third term of Jackson. Because Andrew Jackson literally says to the party and to the American people, look, I'm retiring because I'm going to be like George Washington, 2 terms and done, and I'm going to go back to my plantation and retire in peace. And since you can't have me, have the next best thing, my vice president, Martin Van Buren. And essentially off of that promotion, Van Buren gets elected as the 8th president of the United States. And as you hopefully have read, it is a nightmare. And some of it certainly not his fault. First, the Panic of 1837 was horrific. More importantly, the National Bank had expired in 1836, so there was literally no single financial institution in which the government could do something to help. Jackson's multiple problems, like the specie circular and his pet bank scandal, all these other things all come to fruition. And Van Buren is basically left standing there with his jaw open. And so Van Buren tries to overcome this. Jackson does another thing. On his very last day in office, Jackson recognized Texas independence, which then meant that Texas was now eligible for statehood. And Van Buren, to my knowledge, was never informed about this, and Jackson just swings off, and all that vitriol falls on Van Buren. And so Van Buren has to come up with an alternative to the bank, and he proposes something called an independent treasury. And this would be an independent body of the government, so very similar to what we now have, which is called the Federal Reserve Board. So they would be government-appointed officials, but they would serve for a term. They would handle all of the deposits of the federal government. However, the Treasury would not be open to the public. It would only do the nation's business, financial business, and would handle the national currency. And this is very unpopular. Van Buren has to fight a huge Whig presence in both the House and Senate, constantly taunting him and trying to send him bills. He's getting attacked from all angles. There's something referred to as the Amistad Affair, which is a Portuguese ship sold by Spanish people who are trying to sneak African slaves through basically a blockade that had been put to stop the slave trade. And the ship was taken over by the slaves, and they tried to sail it back to Africa, but instead ended up off the coast of New England. And this started a very, very long fight over what exactly was the status of these people on the boat. Were they people? Were they property? Were they individuals worthy and able to sue in a court of law? And this process goes for a very long time. Van Buren tries desperately to stay out of it, but John C. Calhoun pushes him perpetually on the issue. In addition, John Quincy Adams is now in the House of Representatives. The former president is now a leading advocate for ending slavery, and he agrees to argue the case for the Amistad slaves in front of the Supreme Court and actually wins their freedom. And it's a very controversial deal, and it makes Van Buren look very weak and ineffectual. Van Buren is, I would have to say, quite miserable in the job, but feels compelled to run in 1840 for re-election. And it's actually a rematch with William Henry Harrison. But this time, the Whigs decide to take on the populist playbook of Andrew Jackson. So instead of Senator William Henry Harrison, he's now William Henry Harrison, the hero of Tippecanoe, which was the battle in which he defeated Tecumseh's brother, the Prophet. And so he now becomes Tippecanoe. And he was a national Republican who teamed up with, as his VP, John Tyler, who was an anti-Jackson Democrat. And they formed a little slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. A newspaperman asked Van Buren, what's old Tippecanoe going to do, or what's old Harrison supposed to do if he loses to you a second time? And Van Buren, trying to be derogatory, says, well, I guess he's going to have to go back to Tennessee and live in his old log cabin and drink hard cider, which is basically say he's going to crawl under his rock and drink cheap booze, which is basically to say he's just going to go back to being the hick that he is. When in reality, William Henry Harrison and Tyler both traced their roots back to the early colonial period. They were both descendants of the first families of Virginia. But the Whigs latched onto it and they said, yeah, that's our man, Tippecanoe, the everyday American, right? And they had what's called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign. And it worked. And William Henry Harrison and John Tyler are elected to office in a rather significant election. And basically in 1840, we've reestablished a two-party system in America. Now we have the Whigs versus the Democrats, two solidly separated parties. However, we do need to remember that the Whigs have a philosophical division that's going to create problems in the future. And so when we look at Jackson's time in office, he returned to the federal government the Jeffersonian approach to centralized government, one of as limited national intrusion as possible. And also during this time, the number of eligible voters tripled. Jackson's election embodied the increase, right, of executive power, but it was the idea of the people as being the true sovereigns of the nation. And so Jackson in many ways tries to revive, and does for a moment revive, this ideal of Republican virtue, right? The sort of virtuous farmer now out in the West, being their own person and taking care of themselves without the need of big government. And so we inaugurate William Henry Harrison in 1841, and it's a rather bizarre inauguration. Harrison was elected at the age of 68, which was considered old age in that time. In order to live up to his sort of macho populist image, he rode on a horse in his military regalia, and rode up to the Capitol building in a typical March rainstorm. If you've ever been on the East Coast, in the DC area, rain is very common in the winter, and it is bitter cold rain. And he proceeded to give still the longest inaugural speech of over 2 hours, rode back to the White House for his reception, promptly contracted pneumonia and died in 30 days. And so we get the longest inauguration and the shortest presidency. And with that, we get to the end of the Jacksonian era. And hopefully we will get to hear more about this later on in the context of John Tyler's approach to Manifest Destiny. So hopefully everybody's doing well, and I will see you for our next podcast next week. Bye-bye.